It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to tell you about the Global Fight League. But first, let's check in with John and see how his week has been.
Good. I got prepping for the huge Friday night fight of Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson.
Prepping.
Well, actually, I have no interest in that goddamn fight. But I'll tell you how big that fight is. I've got more calls from people I know that are wondering if I'm watching it. They can come over to watch it. And I never get calls like that. No one gives a shit about and the boxing matches, the MMA matches. No one ever cares. This fight, I've gotten several people calling me about watching it, wanting to watch it with me. And I wasn't planning on seeing it because I actually have no interest in the goddamn fight. But now I'm kind of stuck that I'll probably have people over and have to watch it.
But you know why they called you for this particular fight? Because they want to sit in your presence and observe you as you watch this farcical fight. That's what it is. They want to watch John Nash imbibe this show like a nasty swill drink. That's what they want to do. They want to watch your face as you watch this mess.
I think these are people that don't care about the stuff I like. They know I like fight stuff. That's all they know. These people have no taste, none. They have no taste in movies. They won't go to the movies with me, the movies I like. They won't read the same books I read, but they know I like fighting. They're intrigued by this, and they're like, "Oh, John will want to see this because he's into fighting," not realizing this is like, this is as like a Martin Scorsese neo-realist fan being told that he has to go see the newest Marvel movie. It's like there's a difference. These are two different worlds. So, but yeah, I will have these people over. So I'm hoping actually someone volunteers because I really don't want them over. I'd rather go to someone else's place, and then I can show up late and leave early.
Oh my goodness. Come on now. That's not right.
But it's sad is this fight. It's going to be massive, this event. And we will probably be talking about it next week because it definitely is big enough that it's worth commenting on the business side. Yep. I was thinking before coming up in the holidays coming up, we should probably do an AMA. So if people have questions, get them in over the next couple of weeks.
Sure.
And then we could do, because we might record one for, let's say, the Thanksgiving weekend when no one's available. You'll have someone to listen that holiday weekend instead of talking to your relatives.
That's it. Oh, that's a beautiful idea there. Because who really wants to talk to their in-laws?
Well, some people have in-laws, some don't. Some just don't even want to talk to their outlaws.
All right. Well, before we get to the Global Fight League, we have got 3 questions because some things rolled across our desk. And so I wanted to talk to you first about Mark Shapiro of TKO and some of the comments that he made last week about Dana White getting into boxing. So I guess my first question is, what is the status of Zuffa Boxing, which is Dana White's personal baby?
Well, it did sound like he was putting the brakes a little bit on what Dana White said, like he's getting into boxing. Now, that doesn't mean Dana was lying or wrong. I think the impression Dana made that it was going to be a jumping 2 feet into some major venture, and Shapiro's kind of pumping the brakes a little bit. Not that he said they're not going to get in boxing. He had a comment. He said they see it as doing it with a partner who would fund it and pay us to operate. So they have nothing to announce yet in that area, right? But they're looking into it now. That suggests a couple things.
Explain that to us with they see it with a partner.
Well, that's part of it. That suggests to me, and I think the most obvious is they've been talking to the Saudis, Turki al-Sheikh, Riyadh season, and that makes some sense because remember there were rumors in the past that years ago when they were, when Endeavor bought the UFC that they're going to get into boxing too, and I talked to people, those rumors seem to be very legitimate. But there's a hearsay quote I was given that Ari Emanuel supposedly said that why he kind of did not want to get into boxing because the reason they thought about getting it is because the Mayweather McGregor fight did so much money. They're like, we can't ignore that, right? But then he kind of hesitant, didn't want to go full in because I think his comment, I was told, again, this is hearsay, so I don't know, maybe he didn't say it, but it sounds apt. Sounds like it's possible. The problem, he said, with boxing is the split is 70-30 for the boxers when we need it to be 30-70 for us. Looking at how pro wrestling works and looking at how the UFC works, that sounds very accurate. Now, with this, if they're not putting up the money for the fights, if they're not taking a risk and they're just getting a management fee to produce it, kind of like, and you remember Dana White once said, we're going to be a little while ago, we will be HBO. That kind of goes hand in hand with that. They would do the production, I'm imagining, Endeavor for them. They will do like the sales for them and kind of manage and represent whatever league entity the Turki Al-Sheikh puts together. And they don't have to take the risk, but they can make tremendous returns because they have all the connections to sell the broadcasting rights because they've already made them through WWE and UFC. They have sponsorship connections. They have, the stadium connections and site fees.
Can I ask a quick question there? Because you brought something up. You said the sponsor connection. If they were to have a partner, like, say, the Saudis, how would the sponsor split work? Would they get to keep the sponsors?
Well, I think what would happen, kind of like they do right now, Endeavor does with UFC, is the Saudi entity, whatever it is, the boxers, they would keep the money, but a percentage would go to TKO or Endeavor who, did the sale. And then on top of it, the TKO who's doing the work for the Saudis would get a license fee. Now, remember right now, there was a management fee about $35 million a year being paid from TKO and WWE each to Endeavor. I think was supposed to go up to $100 million. So total. So that's a large amount of money that UFC and WWE is paying actually to Endeavor, I should say, as the management. If they did the same kind of thing with a boxing, that's, right there, that puts you in a one of the bigger boxing promoters with all profits because you have very little expense. You're just doing overseeing doing their sales, things like that, but you don't have to pay the actual costs. So that could be a big winner. Now, there's another rumor that I heard, and I don't want to give the guy's name who told me it, but he's been very accurate because I didn't ask him, but I could say his name, but I'm going to repeat it. He's talking about that TKO has, I guess, had discussions of doing some sort of boxing show with ESPN after Top Rank leaves. And the concept would be like a Dana White Contenders boxing show. Now, that obviously is not going to replace Top Rank completely because Top Rank does world-class boxing. They don't do just the beginning guys. But this would cover some of the other stuff that the UFC said, how they would build it from the ground up themselves. They weren't going to acquire another promotion. And I think so the two things together, I think, might explain what's going to happen with their boxing if they get into it. One is they'll do an event for, signing these Kalen Walsh type figures that they can promote and build up with a Dana White Contender type series that Dana White would love to be involved with because obviously it's kind of his dream on ESPN. And then the second part would be that they would use their all their camera, all their equipment, all the stuff they built up for WWE and UFC, and just use that as kind of a manager, kind of someone like PBC. PBC's the broadcast entity of Al Heyman, so they wouldn't have the responsibility of paying the athletes, but they would put the events on the package on the TV. So for whatever Al-Sheikh's doing, and then charge them a pretty penny for that without taking any of the risk. So I think that's the two big possibilities. I think actually both are very possible.
Wow. All right. Second point of business before we get to Global Fight League. The Sports Business Journal had this piece about how Bud Light used the UFC to recuperate their image. How was the UFC responsible for that, and how did it work? And further, if I could add one more question, is why was Bud Light in a precarious position to begin with where the UFC had to rescue them?
Well, we had talked about this a while back, but there was an article, as you said, the Sports Business Journal gave a little more detail. What happened is Bud Light did an ad campaign with a transgendered. It wasn't an ad campaign. I think it was a viral campaign on their TikTok or whatever, their Instagram account only. It was a very small influencer ad campaign where they gave some some beer to influencer. I can't remember the name of the person, but it was a transgender person. Huge blowback because of the political landscape right now, and a lot of people got upset at InBev, the company that owned it, Bud Light that runs them, and they accused them of being on the side of the woke and all that other stuff, and so they lost a ton of sales. They were being boycotted by the anti-woke. And so in this way, because the UFC has aligned themselves with Trump and the Republican Party and conservatives, as we've talked before about their plan, why they did that years ago, they were in a position where they could rehabilitate the image of Bud Light with these people. At least they could claim they could. And so InBev signed a massive deal with them, as they noticed in the Sports Journal. It's a 9 figures deal, 9 figures being over 100 million over 6 years. So you're talking at least 16 million a year, 17 million a year minimum for 6 years. That's the biggest sponsorship deal the UFC has. So that's a massive deal to be the official beer of the UFC. What's interesting is, so the UFC has been able to use, before they went to the right, because they couldn't get blue chip sponsors, and they had these kind of these low end sponsors, and they just filled up on them. But now, because companies now are trying to cater, because of our tribal split in this country, they have to cater to the right wing supporters, I guess, people on the right. They're now paying, mainstream sponsors now coming to people like the UFC and paying them a ton here to give them a shine with the conservative audience. And because that's their primary UFC audience, it worked out masterfully for them. What's interesting is Bud Light sales are still low. So I don't know how well this has actually worked. But it's worked out great, I guess, for the UFC. But I don't know how well it's worked for Bud Light, because their sales are still down like 28% this year.
I'm sorry. UFC has a lot of smoke and mirrors, right?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, yeah. But the other ways, too, is they are in so tight. They're so now linked with the Trump administration, with Donald Trump and conservatism, that it has opened up opportunities to them that were not existing previously, because, and in some ways it shows the genius, I guess, of Endeavor thinking this before, because like they said, the Fertittas were always obsessed being mainstream. Endeavor came in and realized we are not getting blue chip sponsors. So what we're going to do is go after conservative owned companies that are B or C tier sponsors and get a ton of them, just flood the ring or the cage with them, something you would normally not do. You'd want to have scarcity so you could increase the value. They're saying, no, we're going to flood it and charge a lot. And then at first that generated a lot of sponsorship, but over time, because the UFC is now associated with a conservative audience in Donald Trump, instead of that backfiring and saying, hey, listen, we want to appeal to everybody, the companies are like, we have to appeal to those group of people. We're going to pay a premium now to target that audience that the UFC has access to. So on the Endeavor, the UFC side, got to give them credit. This was very smart because it increased their sponsorship revenue a lot. I don't know though if it's paid off for Bud Light, as we noted, because they're still down 28%.
Quick question about Dana White. How important is he to all these deals? Because his front-facing personality would seem to me like an abrasive thing, but as you were illustrating for us with all the sponsors and everybody falling all over themselves to get a piece of this, of that audience that they cater to, how important is Dana?
Oh, very important. I mean, Dana was always the front person, the figurehead. They built him up as kind of the Vince McMahon of the UFC. We all know that story. But after Endeavor bought him, they've actually put him more in front of the company. He's become more of the symbolic head of the company, almost the mascot, the brand itself. Dana White is so intertwined with the UFC, so much more the major focus of the property than it ever was under the Fertittas. And so in some ways, because of the nature of where we are in the I think in media space, years ago, Dana White being this brash, controversial, especially with his domestic abuse situation, him and his wife slapping each other on New Year's, that would have been a death knell for someone as the front facing representative of a company 20 years ago or so. But because the way the media landscape has been so splintered, because there's been kind of a rejection of the the mainstream, I guess you'd call it mainstream, respectable media, and people want basically an anything goes nature, blowback on that side. I mean, Richard Rorty kind of nailed it back in the late 90s when he talked about there will be a blowback against upper class or professional class type of sensibilities because we have that. Dana White's been protected from some of the more outrageous comments and actions he had that in the past would have come back to haunt him, and now it just feeds more into his image.
I saw something that said that he was one of 11 very powerful men in Donald Trump's immediate circle. I mean, wow. Dana White is now amongst 11 super powerful men in the world.
Well, it wasn't all men. Linda McMahon was on that list. And she might be in the new administration.
That's right. Excuse me for missing that part. But I guess the point I'm trying to illustrate, and hopefully John will expand on, is the massive, massive, not just appeal, but the influence he has now.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable. I think I tweeted this and I got some pushback, and the one pushback I say, I don't know if he's one of the 11 most important people in the Trump. There's people behind the scenes that are probably more important,
right?
But he has major importance to the Trump administration, or not Trump, but to Trump world. He has major influence too, and part of the influence also comes from, I guess I'd say Dana White and Endeavor together. Ari Emanuel should not be ignored too. He has major connections to everybody in media. Major connections around the world to power players, major connections to influence. He runs tons of podcasts, tons of media entities. He can influence stuff tremendously. And then you throw Dana White, who has this tremendous fan base they built for him and this platform at the UFC. And people are like, well, we've seen this before with Don King. I'm old. I'm really old. I was around when Don King was around at the peak. He got involved in politics, and people would laugh because he would be there at fundraising event and dinners, or and endorse political candidates. But he wasn't speaking at the national conventions, right? He wasn't he wasn't standing in for them on debate shows to be a surrogate for the candidate. He was not his events, his boxing matches that Don King had, which he would have a limited number per year because he didn't own the sport. Top Rank would have some of the other big events, other promoters too back then. Dana White, all the big events in MMA are in UFC, and many of them have been turned into campaign events for Trump. Don King never did that. So there's a world of difference between what Don King did politically and what Dana White. And Dana White's influence is that he was, and also we got to remember, Stephen Chung, a former UFC employee, is the campaign manager for Donald Trump. And they've talked about how the UFC was a key part of their plan to expand his outreach to young men, which worked because they had a huge increase of young male voters, young women too, actually, for that matter, but young voters to the UFC. That was their goal, their objective with appealing to the UFC and using it. They talked repeatedly to the press that their plan was to use the UFC to improve Dana White, to create an image for Donald Trump and reach out to UFC fans, and that succeeded. So Dana White plays a major part in that because he further, his relationship with Donald Trump basically reinforces the image they've created for Donald Trump with these young people.
Third and final topic before we get to Globe Fight League is Rainier de Ridder. He had an amazing debut just this past Saturday night, where he beat Gerald Meerschaert. And that's not an easy task considering that he submitted Gerald Meerschaert. But anyways, that's beside the point. He was out there warning fighters from signing with one championship. And as pointed out by you and Globe Services and Aaron Bronstetter, one is not holding very many MMA fights or signing many new fighters. I mean, you have been beating this drum for a long time, for over a year, probably more closer to 2 years that you've been talking about how few fights that they have been having, MMA fights. So what the heck is going on with One Championship?
Well, I think it's very simple. MMA fights are a lot more expensive than Muay Thai, right? And they are getting, because they cannot get and afford the top MMA fighters, to get a top guy that gets any sort of attention. MMA costs a lot more money because there's a lot more competition, because you're dealing with people who want to go to the UFC. The Muay Thai fighters and their kickboxers are just a lot cheaper. And they can present something that they can claim is even a better quality, a higher level than their MMA fight. So we kind of saw this happening. They have some more money apparently coming in. We haven't seen confirmation yet, but another 50 million is supposedly coming in. But by all estimates, they basically burned through all their other money. So they have whatever money they're going to have coming in is going to have to keep them afloat for a while, because you look at it, they are not rolling in the dough. They are not. They have an Amazon deal that is not paying them. I mean, I don't know for sure, but the estimates I've heard, it's not a massive deal. It's a multi-year deal. I think it's got 3 years left on it, 4 years, which, is not great, because if you did great ratings, then you could go back, renegotiate a much bigger deal. Instead, they're locked into this long-term deal that's not paying them a ton of money. My other understanding is they're not making much in other foreign sales of media rights. All their events are now basically held in Thailand. I can't imagine they're making a ton on the gate there. So they're not rolling in it revenue wise. And so they're doing what we kind of suggest would happen. It's not that everybody's like, oh, one's going to go out of business overnight. The thing was not that one would go out of business, because they don't have massive debt. They don't have interest payments that they have to make on their debt. They just burn through capital. The end result of one is kind of what they're happening. They've now shrunk down to basically, in all honesty, a regional promotion, a regional Muay Thai promotion, doing events every week in Thailand. And that's just a much cheaper thing. You can probably keep that going for a long time, but I'm sure people that put in that 500 million, this is not what they expected the end result to be.
So that's going to bring me to my next question, because it looks to me like this has all been a bait and switch, so to speak. I need to know if any of these investors have any kind of recourse here, any legal recourse, since it looks like one just yanked the rug right out from under them after they got the money.
Well, I don't know the full details. I don't know what the plan is with that 50 million they supposedly got, if there's conditions, but I mean, technically people should have done due diligence, and there should be a contract in place of what they have to do with the money. So I'm sure they'll be stuck. There'll be things they have to honor. So they'll be stuck with that. But I just don't see 50 million creating a massive, finishing the duopoly plan they claim they had. They're not going to become a duopoly with 50 million. So especially when they no longer apparently have any MMA fighters, it looks like.
What about Rug?
Well, you know what? That's it. It's Rug Mania is their best hope. He's gonna take them to levels they've never seen before.
All right. So that's going to take us out of our 3 topics and bring us into the main meat of the episode, and that is the Global Fight League. John, what the hell is the Global Fight League? To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Okay, the face!